Double tongue or doodle tongue? Which one is better? Hey everybody, it's Peter Tiarina, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about the pros and cons of double/triple tonguing versus doodle tonguing and the many variations of each. And as a quick note, this video is not based on any facts, it's just based on my own experience and my own opinion, so keep that in mind. Okay, so let's jump right in. We'll talk about the pros for double/triple versus doodle tonguing and then the cons for each one. Okay, so one pro for double/triple tonguing is that generally you have more of an open sound throughout. If you look at the mechanism of, double/triple versus doodle tonguing, you'll see that for the second syllable, it's a little more open for double tonguing. So it's the difference of this versus this. If you look at every other note of each example, for the first example, it should be slightly more open, more resonant. And that's just because with double tonguing or triple tonguing, the ka or ga, whatever syllable you use, allows for more space inside the oral cavity. There's more openness. There's less tongue restricting the airflow. And we'll talk about the doodle side of things a little bit later. So another pro for the double/triple tongue is that for the second syllable, the front of the note is a lot clearer than the doodle tongue. And again, that's just simply mechanics. So potentially, if you have a stronger double tongue, it could sound something like this. As opposed to something like this on the doodle side of things. Another pro of the double/triple tongue is that you can use it in not only like a jazz, commercial, pop, etc. setting, but you can also use it in the classical setting. And as a matter of fact, it's actually the preferred multiple tongue articulation in a classical setting. So this is great for musicians who cross over and play a variety of styles, including classical, and it makes practicing efficient. So here's a good example of that might sound familiar. Another pro for the double/triple tongue is that it can be easier to sound cleaner or crisper. So here's a short jazz line which I actually pretty much stole from jazz trumpet legend and bebop legend Fats Navarro. Now, the final pro that I'll mention for double/triple tongue is that for jazz passages or softer, more lyrical passages in classical music that are faster, you can develop a softer or smoother double tongue. Now, you heard a version of this smoother double tongue in the last passage that I played, but you can also apply it to really anything. Here's like a simple scale that you can apply it to. For the doodle side of things, the first pro is that generally you have a smoother articulation. So this can be especially handy in any jazz setting or really any kind of smooth, faster passage you'd like to play. Often when students are learning double tongue, unless they're specifically trying to develop a smoother double tongue right off the bat, a lot of students tend to over-articulate because you have less control of the muscles in the mouth, especially the tongue, and it gets tired fast. So at first it might sound something like this. And after a while it can sound more even and consistent. And you can even smooth that out, as I mentioned in the pros. But for doodle tongue, you can't really over-articulate and have too hard of an articulation, although that might depend on your personal aesthetic and what you hear and what you want to play. Another pro for the doodle is that it can make it easier to add a little lilt to your eighth note lines, just because of the mechanisms and the way the doodle works. which makes it very welcoming to jazz setting. So here's that same jazz phrase from earlier, but with a doodle tongue at a slower tempo, just because my doodle tongue is not as developed as my double or triple tongue. This next pro for the doodle tongue is a little subjective. In my opinion, the doodle tongue can resemble a valve instrument like a euphonium or a valve trombone. The action that it has moving between notes, I think that it can resemble these instruments more than the double tongue. Although it's definitely arguable and, like I mentioned, subjective, so I'll leave that up to you. So here's a smoother double tongue and a doodle. Now this next pro is one of my favorite things about doodle tonguing, and as I mentioned earlier, it's almost impossible to over-articulate your doodle tongue. In most cases, it just produces a clear attack, a clear articulation. Now, although I'm not the best doodler, here's me trying to over-doodle tongue. Let me know what you think. Now, the last pro that I'll mention about doodle tonguing is that for jazz trombonists, it's actually the preferred articulation. Although don't quote me on that because I don't know all the statistics, but that might be changing because I personally know of a lot of trombonists who double tongue, but I'd say from my experience, thinking back and playing with other trombonists and talking to them and hearing them play, I'd say most of them use doodle tongue, probably because it's by nature an easier articulation, and as I mentioned earlier, it's also a little more friendly to swinging. Regarding cons for the double triple tongue, one thing is that it can take longer to develop a smoother articulation. For most trombonists, especially if you go to a normal school or study classical music, you're probably going to learn how to make your double tongue as articulate as possible, with the harder front. But this may not necessarily be the case for those going, on to study jazz right off the bat and don't have much classical training maybe. They might start developing a smoother double tongue right off the bat. So once you develop a clear double triple tongue, you might have to smooth it out later. At least was the case with me. Another con about double triple tongue is that it can be hard to develop a good swing eighth note that feels good. The way I addressed this a few years ago was basically starting to incorporate my double tongue and triple tongue at slower tempos, like tempos that you can easily or semi-easily single tongue at eighth notes with. So instead of single tonguing like that, I would try to double tongue. Anything, even reading music, I would start to use my double tongue so I can kind of get that developed and have more control over it. Another con for double triple is that it can be harder to articulate in the extreme registers, in the really low register and higher register, just because of the way airflow works. There's not as much air flowing through, especially on the second syllable. So that's something that you might have to spend extra time working on. Now, the last con that I mentioned about double triple tongue is that basically it takes daily regimented practice to both develop and maintain this skill. So it takes a lot of work always, basically, if you want to keep up your double or triple tongue. Okay, so for the doodle tongue, one con is that the second syllable can make your sound a little stuffy just because of mechanics. When you go doodle, the l part, more of your tongue is on the roof of your mouth, so it doesn't allow for as open a cavity as a double or triple tongue. When you double or triple, your tongue is essentially arched on both syllables. With the ku, it goes more like this, ku, ku, ku. So you always have that circle in the middle. Tu, ku, tu, ku. I use tuku. Some people might use tucka or dugga or dugu or whatever, but generally your tongue kind of does this. Tu, ku, tu, ku, tu, ku, tu, ku, tu, ku. Now for doodle, you're letting the air kind of, for the second syllable, come out of the sides of the tongue. So the tongue is more up here, and the air is kind of coming out through the sides. not the front. The tongue doesn't get out of the way on the second syllable, so it has to come out somehow. And that's on the side. So not only do you have less resonance here because there's less space, but the air also isn't flowing as freely, going straight through when your tongue is down. So here's me holding the second syllable. It's subtle, but if you hear it back to back, you can kind of hear the difference. So here's doodle, second syllable, and double, second syllable. Now, another con for the doodle tongue is that there really isn't a place for it in a classical setting. Although one could argue if you have a really highly developed doodle tongue that you could probably use it in faster, smoother passages. And there's always exceptions. Take jazz trombone virtuoso Bob McChesney as an example. He actually recorded the Carnival of Venice and had a really nice, clear, smooth version of it. So the last con I'll mention about the doodle tongue is that, similar to the double triple tongue, it can take longer to develop a cleaner, crisper articulation. It's similar, but the opposite is true for double triple because it's harder to smooth it down unless you start learning that right off the bat. But it's the opposite issue with doodle tonguing. Developing a nice, clear articulation can be tricky. Things can sound really mushy for a while when you're learning how to doodle tongue. And one could say a similar thing with double tongue, but having learned both, it was more of an issue with the doodle tongue. So these are just a few pros and cons that I found for each multiple tonguing articulation type. And one thing I wanted to mention before ending this video is that all articulation, especially multiple tonguing, is all part of a spectrum. One person might say doodle, but they're not doing the exact same mechanism. They could be doing something completely different, but a lot of multiple tonguing falls into the larger umbrella or larger realm of each type that we talked about today. All right, y'all, if you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video or learned something or found it interesting, consider liking and sharing it. And if you haven't done so already, consider subscribing to my channel. If you have any questions or requests or think I might have missed any pros and cons to any of these articulation types, go ahead and leave it down below in the comment section. And until next time, y'all, peace.